Hello, everyone. What if the United States is once again preparing for a major confrontation with Iran? U.S. Ambassador Mike Huckabee says large-scale military action against Iran remains an option, while tensions involving Israel, Syria, Gaza, and Turkey continue to build. But is this simply a warning or a signal that something much bigger could be coming? In this video, we'll break down what's happening and what it could mean for the Middle East. Before we begin, hit like, share, and subscribe, and tell us what you think. Could the U.S. actually strike Iran again? Drop your opinion in the comments. There are no wrong answers, and we want to hear your perspective.
It is definitely one of the most pressing questions right now.
Right. And to really grasp the magnitude of what is unfolding here, for you listening, I kind of have to strip away the daily noise. Our mission in this deep dive is to look strictly at the latest updates, to understand the massive geostrategic implications that are happening on the ground.
Yeah, exactly. Because if you look at the entire chessboard right now, based on the latest info, Washington and Tel Aviv are deeply evaluating these regional security threats. And they're essentially constructing this dual strategy.
A dual strategy.
Yeah. So on one side, you have the maintenance of hard, highly visible military options. And then simultaneously, there's this intense effort to build diplomatic security frameworks across the region.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because to me, this dual strategy kind of feels like a high-stakes geopolitical game of good cop, bad cop.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Right, like you're keeping this incredibly heavy club visibly sitting right there on the table while you're at the same time quietly working on building these diplomatic fences.
What's fascinating here is the timing of that dual approach. I mean, in international relations, ambassador doesn't just casually float a phrase like large-scale military action against a major regional power.
No, definitely not. That's a very specific choice of words.
Exactly. It's a coordinated effort at deliberate strategic signaling. By broadcasting the ultimate military contingency loudly, right now, you force a sudden alteration in your adversary's calculus.
So it transforms the threat of force from just, a vague political talking point into a real pillar of deterrence.
Right, because if Iran or its allied networks operate under the assumption that the military option is completely off the table, maybe due to political fatigue in Washington, their tolerance for risk inherently goes up. They push boundaries.
Yeah, they start testing the fences.
Exactly. But clearly stating that the club is on the table highlights that military contingencies persist right alongside those diplomatic tracks. It's coercive diplomacy in its purest form.
It really is. It's like they're deliberately driving up the tension to make the diplomatic track look like a necessary lifeline rather than a concession.
Yeah, forcing them to take the diplomatic off-ramps more seriously. Because the alternative isn't just economic sanctions anymore.
Right. The alternative is catastrophic kinetic action. But, making a threat like that credible requires an immense logistical footprint. You don't just say military action is an option without moving carrier strike groups and prepositioning assets, right?
Oh, absolutely. And burning billions of dollars to maintain readiness in the Mediterranean and the Gulf. Iran's intelligence networks monitor those exact physical assets to gauge whether Washington is bluffing.
So that physical readiness is really the engine of the whole deterrence geometry.
It is. The words only matter if the hardware is positioned to back them up. And it creates this fascinating paradox where the threat of overwhelming force is actually the mechanism that makes diplomacy viable.
Wow. So by showing you're ready for war, you're actually keeping the peace.
Yeah, it establishes a ceiling on how far proxy networks can escalate without triggering a direct, devastating response.
But see, that brings up a massive vulnerability with this approach.
Yeah.
If you hold a giant stick over Iran, you instantly incentivize them to poke you through their proxy networks, to test your resolve without triggering a direct war.
Right, the whole death by 1,000 cuts scenario.
Exactly. You cannot credibly threaten the head of the octopus if the tentacles are already wrapping around your ankles and causing localized chaos.
That is a very visceral analogy, but it's completely accurate.
So if you are preparing for a major confrontation, you first have to ensure the local neighborhood doesn't accidentally ignite, which I guess leads us directly into the sudden urgency we're seeing regarding the immediate borders.
Yeah, because a local ignition is the ultimate nightmare scenario for military planners right now. If a broader conflict is genuinely on the table, the worst possible situation is a multi-front, unmanageable war triggered by a complete misunderstanding.
Just an accident on a secondary border.
Exactly. And that is why the diplomatic side of this dual strategy is hyper-focused on establishing a trilateral de-escalation mechanism.
Right. The latest news mentioned this involves Syria, Israel, and Turkey.
Yes. The stated goal in the last updates is to keep active communication channels open and mitigate boundary tensions to prevent military spillovers.
Okay, I have to pause on the mechanics of that, though, because setting up a functional de-escalation mechanism between those three specific actors sounds like an absolute logistical and diplomatic nightmare.
Oh, it's incredibly complex.
I mean, Israel and Syria don't even have diplomatic relations. They are technically still in a state of war. And Turkey has immense, highly publicized friction with Israel right now. So how does this actually function in practice?
Well, you really have to separate political friendship from military deconfliction.
Okay, so this isn't just them setting up a trilateral group chat on their phones.
No, definitely not. This isn't about these nations aligning their worldviews or holding summits. It's about establishing cold, hard, pragmatic red lines.
So if a stray munition flies across a border, how do they communicate to prevent an automatic retaliation?
They route data through intermediaries. Because you are absolutely right, Israel and Syria cannot simply pick up a phone. They have to route this deconfliction data through third parties.
Like who?
Historically, and currently in many of these theaters, that involves utilizing Russian military command hubs located in Syria or leveraging Turkish intelligence back channels.
Wow, okay. So it is essentially a high-speed, high-stakes game of geopolitical telephone.
Exactly. Designed specifically to prevent a stray missile or a misidentified drone from starting a massive regional war.
So it's purely mechanical, an early warning system. Like, if Israel needs to conduct an airstrike against a weapons depot in southern Syria, and Turkey has military assets operating near the northern border, that airspace is incredibly crowded.
The most crowded. The airspace over Syria is one of the most contested kinetic environments on the planet.
So this mechanism exists so that one side can pass a message through a third party saying, hey, we're operating in this sector right now. Don't lock your air defense radars onto our jets.
Yeah, and we won't target your outposts. That is the exact functional reality of it, because without those back-channel guardrails, a miscalculated airstrike could accidentally take out a Turkish asset.
And since Turkey is a NATO member.
Right. That immediately triggers a conversation about Article 5 collective defense.
Oh, man, pulling the United States and Europe into a chaotic diplomatic crisis.
Which would distract entirely from the primary deterrence strategy regarding Iran. So by securing these borders via active communication, you isolate the primary theater of operations.
You contain the spillover.
Exactly. If you're going to hold that heavy club over Iran, you need absolute certainty that you aren't going to accidentally trip over the furniture behind you while swinging it.
That makes the sequencing of these moves make total sense. This trilateral circuit breaker isn't an alliance at all. It is just a vital pressure valve.
A pragmatic necessity.
But securing the external borders in the north and east, I mean, that's only half the geopolitical equation. Even if you establish that perfect firewall with Syria and Turkey, the whole strategy collapses if the internal security situation demands constant military intervention.
You're referring to Gaza.
Right. Because if you are preparing for a massive confrontation, you cannot have a bleeding wound internally that just drains away military assets and logistical focus. And the latest news regarding the Gaza Strip shows a pretty drastic shift in how that internal crisis is being handled.
It's a massive shift. The updates on Gaza address a severe reconstruction bottleneck, and it highlights a fundamental shift in policy because the core issue driving this is that Hamas has not surrendered its arsenal or its missile capability.
Right, the weapons are still there.
Exactly. So consequently, the position being enforced right now is that reconstruction efforts in Gaza are completely frozen. They will not commence as long as Hamas retains its rockets.
And the U.S. has firmly reaffirmed Israel's right to self-defense against those specific capabilities, right?
Yes, that was explicitly stated in the recent information.
Here's where it gets really interesting. To put this into perspective for you listening, it's basically like a geopolitical stalemate. You cannot lay the foundation to rebuild a house if the people inside are still actively holding the dynamite.
That is exactly what's happening.
Because historically, in a lot of these conflicts, the international community would rush in to provide the painkillers, right? The humanitarian aid, rebuilding the infrastructure, while simultaneously trying to negotiate the surgery of disarmament over years or decades.
But that decoupling often resulted in a cycle of violence. International donors would pour billions into rebuilding, only for a militant group to utilize the ensuing ceasefire to rebuild its arsenal.
And then 2 years later, a new conflict erupts, and the newly built infrastructure is just destroyed again.
Exactly. So what we are looking at now is a paradigm where they are withholding the painkillers entirely to force the surgery. It structurally links the humanitarian timeline to the military timeline in a way that is incredibly uncompromising.
Wow, so it completely redefines the prerequisites for stability in the immediate region.
It does, by inextricably tying infrastructural reconstruction directly to military disarmament. It shifts the pressure entirely. It leverages the reality of donor fatigue.
Because the international community is not going to underwrite the rebuilding of a city if the fundamental military threat that caused the destruction is still completely intact.
Precisely. By stating that zero reconstruction happens while the arsenal exists, it places the burden of the civilian humanitarian crisis squarely on the retention of those weapons.
It removes the option of a comfortable stalemate.
It's a stark application of leverage meant to force a definitive end to the armed capability of Hamas, rather than accepting a temporary ceasefire that leaves the core threat intact.
Because if you allow the arsenal to remain, you are basically accepting that Israel will inevitably have to exercise that right to self-defense again.
Right. And going back to our main thesis, Washington and Tel Aviv cannot maintain a credible, high-level deterrence posture against Iran if they are locked into a perpetual, localized war of attrition in Gaza.
Disarmament is no longer just an ideological goal for them.
No, it is a strict, mandatory prerequisite for the broader regional strategy to even function.
But tying Gaza's reconstruction so rigidly to disarmament, that creates a massive vulnerability in the short term, doesn't it? It creates an incredible amount of localized pressure.
It definitely does.
And when you apply that much pressure to one node of a proxy network, you inherently incentivize allied groups in the region to attack from elsewhere, just to relieve that pressure. If Hamas is being squeezed to the point of disarmament, other regional actors aligned with Iran might escalate their own operations to distract the U.S. and Israel.
Which is exactly why this broader macro-level defense architecture suddenly became an urgent priority. We aren't just looking at isolated policies here.
We are looking at the rapid assembly of a regional shield. Let's zoom out to the broader geopolitical map.
This is where the recent information regarding the Mecca Joint Defense Agreement becomes the keystone of the entire map.
Right. The U.S. ambassador specifically referenced the signatories of this agreement.
He did, pointing to their active efforts to bolster regional defense postures. These allied nations are actively working to enhance deterrence mechanisms across key regional flashpoints, specifically amid the growing security challenges we just discussed.
So what does this all mean? Looking at the Mecca signatories and the architecture being built, it looks to me like they aren't actually trying to posture for an offensive war to defeat Iran militarily.
No, that's not the goal.
Instead, it seems like they are trying to build a defensive wall that is so high and so integrated that an adversary basically bankrupts itself trying to climb it. Is that the actual strategic goal here? Are we looking at the formation of a unified, multinational defensive grid?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that is the ultimate manifestation of the dual strategy, because a kinetic threat like the large-scale military option mentioned at the start is really only as effective as the defensive foundation it stands on.
You can't swing a club if you don't have a shield.
Exactly. You cannot project power offensively if your own regional allies are highly vulnerable to retaliatory missile strikes or drone swarms.
So the deterrence mechanisms being bolstered by the Mecca Agreement signatories serve as that structural framework.
Yes. Historically, many of these regional Arab states relied almost exclusively on the United States security umbrella. But now we are seeing a shift toward an integrated, interlocking security grid among themselves.
What does an interlocking grid actually look like?
It involves shared early warning radar systems, coordinated intelligence sharing regarding proxy movements, and overlapping air defense postures.
So it is like watching a massive, incredibly complex lock being assembled in real time. Every single pin has to drop into the exact right place for the overall security mechanism to hold.
That's a perfect analogy.
You have the ultimate kinetic threat kept visible on the table. You secure the northern and eastern borders with the trilateral deconfliction mechanism to prevent accidental sparks. You attempt to freeze the internal threat in Gaza by making disarmament the absolute prerequisite for any rebuilding. And finally, you integrate the broader regional allies into a cohesive defense pact to absorb any retaliatory shocks.
And when you synthesize all of those distinct developments, the overarching reality of the current Middle East becomes very clear. You cannot separate these issues.
They're all linked.
Completely. You cannot analyze Gaza in a vacuum. You cannot look at the Syrian border in a vacuum. And you certainly cannot understand the posture toward Iran in a vacuum. Stability across the entire region is inextricably tied together.
Yeah.
The Mecca defense arrangements, the trilateral communication lines routed through back channels, the shifting paradigm of humanitarian leverage, they're all interconnected, dependent components of one massive geostrategic equation. It is a comprehensive blueprint intended to raise the cost of aggression for any state or non-state actor trying to disrupt the balance.
Which I think leaves us with a critical, lingering question for you listening. We started by examining that heavy club on the table, the very real, viable option of large-scale military action. If that action truly remains on the table and these complex regional defense frameworks are rapidly being bolted into place to contain the fallout, how long can this delicate balance of deterrence hold before the system is actually tested?
It's the ultimate question.
Right. And more importantly, what happens if a silent third party, say a global superpower like China or Russia, decides to quietly subsidize the proxy networks with unregulated arms and capital, specifically to keep the United States permanently bogged down in this interlocking Middle Eastern web? If the system is designed to contain a regional shock, how does it handle a global distraction? Thank you all for listening and watching this deep dive. If you want to continue exploring these complex global issues with us, be sure to listen to our other podcasts. See you next time.